Some of you may recall that it took a little over a year to cover the book of James. I'm not sure of the pace that we're going to have, but before you can do an entire book, as we're going to do today, the book of Titus, you really need to have an introduction. So it'll be a relatively short introduction, but what I wanted to do is to give us the background for the book of Titus so that we'll have an opportunity then to read this big book consisting of 2 sides of 1 page plus a couple extra verses. But I want us to be able to do that before we have our next month's Bible study. To begin with, in the book of Titus, first of all, we know it was written by the Apostle Paul. We know that because he told us right in the first verse in Titus 1:1. And there's really a lot in this one verse. Paul, a bondservant of God and an apostle of Jesus Christ, according to the faith of God's elect and the acknowledgement of the truth which accords with godliness. There's some Old English in there, but Paul saying he's a bondservant of God. A bondservant is someone who is hired to do a job. He has a pledge, there's a price for that, and an apostle of Jesus Christ. An apostle is someone who's sent out. And according to what? Not just for any reason, but according to the faith of God's elect. Well, that brings up the question, God's elect. So who are God's elect? The one that God has called. And you have to do it with the acknowledgement of the truth, which accords with godliness. And we live in a world where truth is not particularly valuable. And so Paul is saying this truth, which matches or syncs with godliness, is important. I have sold my life to God, and I'm now carrying the news. I'm going forth as an apostle of Jesus Christ. So we know this book, as it were, is written by the Apostle Paul. It's really a letter. We call it a book, but it's really a letter at that time. We also know that he's writing to Titus, and Titus was a Gentile Christian, which is interesting because the early Christians were largely Jewish. But we read then in Galatians 2:3, he's referring to Titus and knowing that he's a Gentile because Paul told us that he's yet not even Titus, who was with me, being a Greek, was compelled to be circumcised. So he's acknowledging that Titus was Greek. He was a Gentile. He wasn't Jewish, which is unusual when most of the early converts, particularly in Jerusalem, were Jewish. We also know that Titus was described as Paul's partner in 2 Corinthians 8:23. And these are all verses that I'm quoting from the New King James version of the Bible, of that translation. If anyone inquires about Titus, he's my partner and a fellow worker concerning you. Or if our brethren are inquired about, they are messengers of the churches, the glory of Christ. So he's openly described by Paul as being my partner and a fellow worker. That's pretty high praise from somebody who's accorded many of his letters to be accounted as Scripture. We also know that Titus went to Jerusalem with Paul. And we read this in Galatians 2:1. After 14 years, I went up again to Jerusalem with Barnabas and took Titus with me. Now, Titus was a Greek, likely from Macedonia. And so he took Titus with him to a conference in Jerusalem. Titus was also given the responsibility to take a corrective letter to the Corinthians. Now, it may have been 1 Corinthians, or it could have been another letter that isn't in Scripture. But we read in 2 Corinthians 7, in verses 5 through 15, but particularly in 15, and his, meaning Titus's, affections are greater for you as he remembers the obedience of you all, how with fear and trembling you received him. So the Corinthian church received Titus when Paul sent him to carry that letter. And we can read the rest of that portion of Scripture in 2 Corinthians 7, 5 through 15 to read about that. But he refers to Titus being his helper in that regard. Titus also was organizing the Corinthian church or churches to collect money for the poor in Jerusalem. If we read 2 Corinthians in chapter 8, verses 16 and 17, he makes this reference if we read this section of 2 Corinthians in chapter 8. But thanks be to God who puts the same earnest care for you into the heart of Titus, for he not only accepted the exhortation, but being more diligent, he went to you of his own accord. Titus said, yeah, I'll do that. You don't have to force me. I'll go on this trip to help out. So Titus went at Paul's request to collect money for the poor. There were poor people that were in Jerusalem that were church members, and the ones in Corinth had more money. There was more wealth, and it was a matter of helping those in the church. We also know that Paul wrote to Titus this book while Titus was in Crete. Now, Crete is an island, a very large island in the Mediterranean Sea. We know this because right here in Titus 1 and verse 5, Paul writes, now, Paul had been in prison in Rome at that time. We read in Acts 28. And so he wasn't in Crete or nearby. So he wrote to Titus while Titus was in Crete. And because somebody had to carry on the work, Paul was in prison. And there were many people that considered that the people of Crete had bad characters. And of course, that was, and Paul was aware of that. So what did he tell Titus? In Titus 1, verse 5, for this reason I left you in Crete, that you should set in order the things that are lacking, and appoint elders in every city, as I've commanded you. So Paul wrote to Titus while Titus was in Crete, that large island in the Mediterranean. He also then, as we read the same verse, Titus had the instructions to organize the churches, to finish or to continue what Paul had started, and to appoint elders in every city. So Paul gave Titus specific instructions, organize the churches, appoint elders, and then he carried on further. He instructed, and as we read in Titus chapters 2 and 3, Paul instructed Titus how to teach various groups of people. And he specifically addressed the older men, the younger men, the older women, the younger women. Then he said Christian servants and then citizens. Not everybody in the Roman Empire was a citizen. And so there were specific instructions in each of these cases. And we read that as we get on into Titus chapters 2 and 3. So in order for us to be fully prepared for the Bible study next month, I want you to take this background, understand this background, and read this book of Titus, this letter that Paul has written. And then we're going to go over that on next month, starting on next month's Bible study. Like I say, I don't think it'll take a year, but I'm not making any promises. The background of the book of Titus, we know it was written by the Apostle Paul. We know that Titus was a Gentile Christian, Greek. Titus was described as Paul's partner. We know that Titus went to Jerusalem with Paul. We know that Titus carried Paul's corrective letter to the Corinthians. We know that Titus organized the Corinthians to collect money for the poor church members in Jerusalem. We know that Paul wrote this letter to Titus while Titus was in Crete, and he gave specific instructions that Titus had to appoint men to lead and organize the churches. And then Paul went on in the book of Titus how to teach various groups of people. So fundamentally, that's my simple request with this background. Now let's read it, absorb it, do our best to understand it, so when we come next month, we'll be very conversant on the book of Titus.